I remember walking into the house on a cold winter night. The snow and icy wind blew through the front door as I stepped inside, and I also remember kicking off my boots to clean them before coming in. As soon as I entered, I noticed a strange smell in the place. It smelled like bedbugs, with hints of copper and bleach. I despised the smell of bedbugs. Upon entering, I called out, "Hello, dear? Where are you? I'm starving. Do you smell something weird here too?" The road was at a standstill for almost half an hour. A truck had overturned in the middle of the blizzard, closing all 3 lanes. We could only inch along the parking lane until the cops arrived and started. My voice trailed off as I noticed the drops of blood on the floor, leading from the front hallway to the kitchen. I immediately stopped speaking, scanning for signs of an intruder. I found nothing, no broken windows, no forced doors, no open drawers, or ransacked cabinets. "Oh my God," I whispered as I walked toward the kitchen and grabbed the largest cleaver the first could find from the knife block. Its edges were gleaming, freshly sharpened, ready to cut through the toughest meat. I made sure not to step on the blood drops. I didn't want to disturb the potential crime scene, if it indeed was one. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking about calling the police. But an inner voice urged me to follow that trail of blood. Plus, the police should be here in 5 or 6 minutes, probably more, and you need to check on your family now. With that, I followed the blood trail down the hallway that led straight to the first-floor bathroom. The door was shut. I tried to open it and found it locked. So, I said while knocking on the door, "Hello, is anyone in there?" A weak voice asked me, "Isaac? Is that you?" I immediately recognized it was my wife's voice. "Open the door," I shouted. Waves of anxiety and adrenaline began coursing through my body, and I instantly knew something was very wrong. I could hear it in the dead tone of my wife's voice that something terrible was about to unfold. I felt it in the air like the calm before a storm. "Jenna, open the door," I shouted again. After a few seconds, I heard a slight movement in the small bathroom as if someone was crawling on the floor. Then I heard a click from the lock. I swung the door open and found a scene worthy of nightmares. My only son lay face down in the bathtub. My wife sat at the edge of the tub, rocking back and forth. Her eyes were vacant and lifeless. I whispered in horror, "Why? Why did you do this?" Mumbling in a hoarse voice, she said, "Don't you know? Don't you really know that our son is the Antichrist?" Maybe I had suspicions that something wasn't right with Max. It was more than the dead animals I found scattered in the yard and under the house. It was more than the way his eyes seemed to glow in the dark when I wished him goodnight. It wasn't a good feeling. It was a cold, empty feeling that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He had no friends at school, and animals avoided him like the plague. Dogs started barking and howling when he walked down the street. Cats would hiss and vanish in the blink of an eye with a flick of their tails. These things on their own weren't evidence of anything, but they were far from the only signs that Max was unusual. A month ago, 2 boys tried to bully Max in the school restroom. However, the boys ran out of the bathroom crying and wetting themselves, blood trickling from their noses and ears. They couldn't tell anyone what happened, and Max continued smiling and looking at them with his large, dark eyes. The school called an ambulance, and the doctors were baffled by what they saw. The boys had to sit in the emergency room for 3 hours before the bleeding stopped. They were as white as sheets when the wounds finally sealed, yet even after investigating why they were bleeding, the doctors had no idea of the cause. The 2 boys vanished a few days later. The case caught the attention of local media at the time. The FBI got involved but found absolutely nothing. It seemed like the boys had been abducted, and then their trail immediately went cold. Tracker dogs couldn't find any hint of a trail. It was as if they teleported out of their rooms. A few months later, some people hiking the Appalachian Trail found fingers growing on a tree along the trail. These trees were over 50 miles away from their homes. The FBI intervened and used DNA tests to figure out whose fingers those were, and they traced them back to the missing boys from Max's school. However, no one ever explained how the rotten fingers had fused into the tree. No one dared to bully Max after that. In fact, the other children kept even more distance from my son. I tried to observe Max when he didn't know I was watching. He was just an 8-year-old boy, but he could wear social masks like a psychopath. He could charm almost anyone he met. As soon as they turned away, he'd furrow his brow and narrow his eyes as if he wanted to stab them in the back. But he was my son after all. I loved him, and I think he loved me too. In a strange way, but he loved me. My wife said she loved him and she claimed that's why she had to kill him. A strange kind of love. But I don't think she's lying. I think she loved him and feared what would happen when his ascension ended and he sat on a throne of bones, crushing the lives of millions with his heart of iron. I fear the future consequences for him. I worry about him, she'd say with a voice on the verge of tears. And that's why she had to kill him and stop this now, before it became a steamroller and he sent countless souls to hell. Hours earlier that morning, Max came to me while I sat at the kitchen table and said, "Are you my real father?" I slowly set down my coffee cup, hands trembling, and then turned to look at my son, saying with a choked voice, "Of course I am. Why would you ask such a question?" He stared at me for a long moment. His eyes were so dark they seemed black. They glowed with a faint light within them. His pale, white skin looked as smooth as a marble statue and his dark hair fell over his chiseled features. If it weren't for his indifference to humanity and his cruelty, he would have been a very handsome boy. Instead, he radiated a chilliness like that of the moon, an aura that emitted light but no warmth. It was a sort of Martian and psychopathic detachment that extended to everything he did. He laughed when he saw car accidents on the road or heard news about wars and murders. "I don't think you're my real father," he said, still staring at me, reading me like a book. I felt myself starting to sweat. With fear in every word, I said, "Son, that's ridiculous. Your mother and I are married." Then he asked me, "So where does my power come from? Why'd I have things you'll never possess?" "I know I'm related to Mom," he spat the word mom as if it were filthy. "But you, I don't know. I don't know where my divinity comes from. You seem weak and silly. At least Mom has the courage to admit she hates me, but you crawl around pretending to care for me. I see you when I'm turned away. You mock me in my ascension. I know you do. You're just a little man like all the others. Like your kind, you're as eradicable as fleas, walking around the world without sense or will for power. You don't understand someone like me. You could never understand someone like me, not in a million years." Scared by all of this, I gathered my strength and said, "I don't understand all this talk about ascension. I think you're living in a fantasy world." Promptly, he responded, "If it were a fantasy world, then the fruit wouldn't be revealed. But it will be. Soon everyone will see, even you. I'll be with my true father and become the absolute king of this world. Little men like you will crawl like worms. They'll be crushed under my feet as I ascend to heights never before seen. It's all part of my transformation. My greatness will shine like a second sun. People will remember my name with admiration and terror for 1,000 years." He spoke all of this like a determined adult. I stared at him with my mouth agape. He had a distant expression in his eyes, a fanatic gleam that sharpened his cold features. I remembered when he was just a baby. I knew it back then, watching him play with his toys. I think I knew what he was. After that, Max turned and walked out of the house, grabbing his backpack as the school bus stopped in front of the house. I watched him leave. He walked confidently with a soldier's straight back. As he walked toward the bus, I thought I saw an aura of swirling black shadows around him. I rubbed my eyes, disbelieving what I was seeing, and like mist under the hot summer sun, I saw him dissolve into thin air. I returned to the kitchen, sweating and frightened. With trembling hands, I tried to pick up the coffee cup. Immediately, the cup slipped from my nervous fingers and crashed onto the floor. About 50 minutes later, I was working at home when the first ambulances and police cars rushed at high speed toward Max's school. Later that day, a neighbor who was a teacher at the school where the kids attended, Mr. Holland, recounted to me the story of what happened at the school from his perspective. I don't remember how much I believed in what he said at that moment. I think nothing. But now I don't disbelieve what he told me. As he pushed his oversized glasses closer to his eyes, Holland said to me, "The day started normally. The kids started going to the classrooms and the bell rang like every other day. I started preparing my class notes for the first period. That's when the screaming began in the school hallway. It sounded as if a girl was being murdered. An endless, agonizing scream that continued and continued. Suddenly, everything stopped and a deadly silence fell. All the students looked nervously at each other. A hissing voice came from the school intercom. A reptilian voice that made my skin crawl. The voice began speaking and I immediately knew it wasn't human. And yet, it sounded exactly like your son Max. I mean, he's been in my class for years. Isn't that strange? It was as if someone had taken his voice and run it through some kind of synthesizer to make it deeper and slower.
"Hello, friends,"
the voice whispered, and the words echoed through all the classrooms and corridors.
"We have a very special day planned for you. The activities are already prepared and the festivities are about to begin. Don't try to escape. That breaks the rules of the game. The first sheep have already been slaughtered. Good luck.
I thought some criminal had entered the office and somehow used the intercom while the secretary was grabbing a cup of coffee or using the bathroom. I raised my hands trying to calm them down as the children began talking. Kids, it's clearly just a prank. Please calm down. As I tried to control the situation, the classroom door opened and a girl rushed in. She was covered in blood from head to toe. She had deep cuts on the back of her head, forehead, right cheek, and right arm. Large, foul drops of blood fell behind her as she ran, as if leaving breadcrumbs to find her way back. The wounds on her body changed color before our eyes, turning purple and then black. Necrotic tissue began spreading and dying in mere moments. Dark blood oozed from the wounds. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but only a choked sigh came out. Something had infested the girl, I could see. I quickly stepped back, feeling as if this was a dream. She whimpered, kneeling. Please, God, please help me. The children in the classroom started screaming, and she said again, Please, someone help me. Her voice grew louder, her skin paler as the bruised and dying patches of tissue spread. She opened her mouth and began vomiting a dirty, oily mud. It hurts, she moaned, collapsing in the vomit pool. Won't anyone help me? I rushed to her side. I didn't know this girl. She wasn't in any of my classes, but I knew she needed immediate medical attention. I asked, What happened? Who did this? She leaned close to my ear and whispered, There are things in the hallways that shouldn't exist. After that, she coughed up more blood and black liquid, rolling onto her back and struggling to breathe. Her eyelids began to twitch and her skin grew paler. I thought she was losing consciousness until her eyes rolled back and she sat up smiling. Claws began emerging from her fingers, black tears streamed down her face, and that dark mud dribbled from her mouth like sickly saliva. Her body started elongating, her arms and legs twisting and breaking. I could hear bones snapping like tree branches in a storm. I watched the transformation in horror as I stepped back. The other children were all screaming and running to the back of the classroom. She stood up and walked toward the frightened children. Her movements were as smooth as a professional dancer's. Indeed, it was a nightmare, but what came next was far worse. His body grew taller, thinner, and more gaunt, stretching up to the ceiling, towering over all the other children in the class. She must have grown at least 2.5 meters tall. Her arms extended, white claws sharpened as she lunged at a row of screaming children. I saw blood splattering on the back wall of the room, and some boys fell forward with their throats open. Their panic-stricken faces turned pale and bloodless as they choked and tried to scream, but only bubbling gasps came out. I noticed the window was open and I was on the first floor. I decided to run to seek help. I knew we needed police and medics on site, and I also knew I couldn't do anything to save the children. Honestly, I feel terrible about it, but I still ran away. As the screams followed me from the back of the classroom, I jumped out of the window, ran across the playground, and climbed over the fence. But as I walked, I heard a strange, shrill laughter coming from the intercom. And you know what? I'm sure the voice was Max's. Max came back early from school that day, smiling and laughing. He was in a good mood. I don't know what happened after the teacher left or how many people died in that building, but I know Max caused it all. I know these were the first steps on the path to his ascension, the fundamental layer for his throne of bones. Mr. Holland had talked to Jenna that morning, right after coming home from that den of nightmares, and as soon as she heard our neighbor's words, Jenna began putting a plan into action. When Max returned from school, she gave him a Gatorade with a large amount of fentanyl she had bought from a dealer downtown. She added a bit more sugar to mask any slight bitterness in the drink and gave it to the boy, who was smiling and had dilated pupils like smoldering coals. He drank it quickly, looking at her the whole time with his widened eyes. He smiled at Jenna, and shortly after, he collapsed. Jenna found him unconscious in his room and dragged him to the bathroom. She filled the bathtub and kept Max underwater until bubbles stopped coming out of his mouth and nose. As my wife explained everything that happened, a feeling of loss and horror washed over me. I didn't know if I missed Max or not. His swollen, blue face undoubtedly showed he was lifeless. I led my wife outside and sat her at the table, wondering whether I should call the police or not. No one ever told me what to do in this situation, and I felt like I was flying blind. I got up and walked to the stove in the kitchen, starting to make instant coffee. Soft footsteps rustled behind me. I turned to see Max standing there, seemingly alive and well, but also changed in a fundamentally disturbing way. His eyes were completely black now. He hovered inches above the floor behind my wife. Smiling at me, his teeth looking much sharper and longer than before. A sense of electricity crackled in the air. I could see a kind of expansive black aura rippling around his pale skin. Shivers ran through my body just being near that sickly aura. The water kettle began boiling behind me. Behind him, I saw the strange, mutated children from the school emerging from the front hallway. 4 or 5 of them slid in with their emaciated, twisted legs, bending in a way no human leg should. Their heads nearly scraped the low kitchen ceiling. Their pale, broken arms reached down to their knees, jointed in numerous areas. I could hear the faint snapping of bones as they slowly advanced, a light, crackling sound like small broken twigs underfoot. Their expressionless, black eyes constantly dripped ebony tears that stained their colorless, bloodless skin.
Mom? Mommy?
Max said condescendingly, sounding like a disappointed father.
You should know you can't kill me except by decapitation or burning my body. Do you think my true father would allow a useless louse like you to kill me before my ascension to the throne? You were so foolish and blind.
Jenna started crying, refusing to look at her son. The boy, who was no longer just a boy, kept on.
But I respect your courage in action, so I will grant you a quick death.
Then he looked directly at me and continued.
That's something you won't receive, my false father. You are a weak and useless coward and deserve to die slowly, screaming until you're hoarse and begging for release. For the cries of the weak, they sound like a beautiful symphony to the ears of my true father. The death of the weak will pave the way for a new world.
He pointed at the mutated children behind him. Their bodies were so contorted that I couldn't tell if they were boys or girls. They just seemed like monsters now, like walking corpses. In the blink of an eye, one of them ran and grabbed my wife's head. A scream bubbled in my throat as I watched, but it ended before I even knew what was happening. The thing used its twisted, clawed fingers to twist her head, breaking her neck in a second. Jenna's face was now looking directly backward, her neck skin forming macabre folds. In her broken flesh, I saw ruptured blood vessels and quickly spreading purple bruises. She gave a deadly sigh, releasing an endless, suffocating breath, her eyelids trembling, and then she lay motionless. Max let out a slow, deep laugh, a rough sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. His black eyes gleamed with amusement and pleasure. Max smiled, and his bright, white, vampiric teeth reflected the cold winter sunlight streaming through the window. The kettle started whistling as rising torrents of steam poured out of it. Without hesitation, I spun and grabbed it, opening the spout by pressing the button on the handle, then I threw it at Max. The boiling water spiraled through the air from the metal kettle. Everything seemed to happen as if in slow motion. I saw Max's triumphant and amused expression turn into a scowl of hatred and rage, but the movement was so fast and precise that he couldn't dodge it in time. The heavy metal kettle hit his face, pouring scalding water all over his face and neck. He screamed and fell backward, knocking down the mutant bodies of the children he had turned into his followers. I ran toward the door without looking back. Outside, the steady flow of police sirens and ambulances heading toward the school had stopped. Now, dozens of black SUVs were entering the town. Men in black suits and mirrored sunglasses got out. I looked back at the house and saw some of the men running in with automatic rifles. Others headed for neighbors' houses, breaking down doors and entering without knocking. I heard gunfire and hoarse screams echoing. The mutant children ran out of my house, their bodies riddled with bullets. They slowly lost energy as their black blood dripped from multiple wounds. They finally fell on the streets, dying with a final rough gasp. However, they never found Max. They quarantined the town, going from house to house and building to building, searching for the source of all this death and malevolence. But somehow he vanished. They took the lives of all the mutant fanatics they could find, but the bodies of many school children had disappeared. I knew where they had gone. They followed Max, little soldiers forming his new apocalyptic army, unafraid of death and committed to their leader and his new world order. I don't know where Max went or where he will appear next, but I know he's marching toward his ascension. And the next time I see him, he will come with power and glory, destroying the lives of millions of people.